A very warm welcome, everybody, to this episode on Western political thought. In this episode, we will very specifically focus on Karl Marx's understanding of state with reference to his theory of historical materialism, or what is commonly or popularly known as materialist interpretation of history. The two issues or the two ideas, in fact, are very closely interrelated. One cannot have a proper understanding of Marx's theory of state, which again is very unique and which in a way distinguishes him in a very important way, in a very big way, from traditional ideas of state, which was shared by, say, many other writers like, say, Hobbes or Machiavelli or Aristotle or many others. Now, to have an understanding of Marx's theory of state, we have to, however, start off with his theory of historical materialism. Historical materialism, incidentally, is actually an application of the principles of dialectics to the understanding of human history. Now, the core idea of historical materialism is something like this. There are two things or two elements involved in this understanding. The first element is the idea or the concept of, say, human labor. That is, history is not something which is made by God, or history is not something which is a product of some, say, mystical forces about which, say, man has no understanding. That history is something the meaning of which is incomprehensible to man. This is summarily rejected or dismissed by Marx. So Marx's first proposition is that history is made by man. Man is the maker of history. Man is the author of history. This is the first proposition. The second proposition, and this second proposition is in a way, it may looks or it may appear to be a kind of principle which is as if opposed to the first principle. Marx says, yes, man is the maker of history, no doubt. Man is the author of history. There is no doubt about that. But is it a fact that man can build up history on his own? That is, man can freely make his history? The answer is no. If the first principle has its focus on subject and subjectivity, that is man, then the second idea underlying historical materialism is this, that man makes history, but man makes history only in the context of the historical circumstances in which he is placed. That is, man is not above history. Man is not above his circumstances. That is, it is the objective situation, the objectivity of the situation, the objective circumstances which create conditions for man to build up his history. In other words, here you come across the play of dialectics. That is, on one hand you have the subject that is man is the maker of history. On the other side, you also recognize the importance of the objectivity of circumstances, which actually create the conditions for man to create his history in his or her way. In other words, it is implied in this understanding that there is no universal rule, there is no universal principle which would suggest that throughout the world, in all countries, well, there is a particular pattern along which history will move. Yes, in every country, well, people of that country, they will make their own history. There is no doubt about that. But they will make their own history only in accordance with the circumstances in which they are placed. By keeping these two ideas in mind, which actually constitute the foundation of historical materialism, then we now take a closer look at how Marx develops this idea of materialist interpretation of history, popularly or commonly known as historical materialism. The basic idea is this. As I said, when Marx starts off with the proposition, man makes his own history, what exactly is meant by that? How does man make his own history? Man makes his own history by his labor. So labor is the most important category in the making of human history. Now, as soon as the question of labor comes in, Marx then actually arrives at two other concepts. These two other concepts, they center around another key concept, that is what is known as production. After all, with the help of human labor, what kind of objective man wants to achieve? What is the importance of human labor? And therein Marx actually distinguishes or differentiates human labor from animal labor. Animal labor that is primarily invested in the satisfaction of one's instincts, biological instincts, nothing beyond that. But human labor is something much more, something beyond, say, satisfaction of instincts. That is, human labor is essentially creative labor. Creative in the sense that man is able to produce goods. Man is able to engage his labor in the manufacturing of, creation of products. And as soon as Marx associates labor with the phenomenon of production, that leads Marx to the development of, as I just mentioned, but I did not elaborate it, that leads Marx to develop two other elements, two other very important attributes which follow from the phenomenon of production. One is, he describes it, he calls it productive forces. The other he calls production relations. This relationship between productive force and production relation, that actually constitutes the key to the understanding of Marx's theory of historical materialism. Now, let me very briefly explain what is meant by productive force, what is meant by production relation, and what exactly is the relationship between productive force and production relation. And why is it that this relationship constitutes the key to the understanding of Marx's theory of historical materialism. By productive force, very simply it means the tools developed by human labor, and thereby these tools are technological tools. With the help of these tools, you can produce things. You can produce things to satisfy your wants. So that is the purpose of productive force. That is, productive force, it is, or in productive force is involved the idea of technology. And productive force, the need for productive force and the development of productive force, well, these are associated with the idea of continuous development of science and technology. So this is the basis, the essence of productive force. And then we come across production relation. You can easily guess that if you can control the productive force, then you have power in your hands. You can control society. Because with the help of, or with your control on productive forces, and you will always try to retain your control over productive forces, you can retain your hold over society. Because with the help or with your control on productive forces, you can control the production process. And what is the importance, what is the significance of your control over production process? The control over production process means that you can retain your hold on the entire society. If you know that you can control the production system, then you have real power of the society in your hands. And that means, and this is the beginning of Marx's, or one can say this is the starting point of Marx's theory of historical materialism. That is, Marx says there was a time in human history, Marx calls it primitive communism, when the productive forces were very primitive, productive forces were very crude, and people used to produce with the help of technology only those things which was necessary for man to survive. But with the development of productive forces, you come across a situation, and this situation, this moment arrived in human history at one point, which showed that you can produce more than you require. So you generate surplus production. That means with the help of productive forces and with the control over productive forces, if you can control the surplus, then you retain power in society. Those who have hold over the productive forces, the technology, they wield power in society. And those who do not have control over the productive forces, well, they are the victims of this power game. This is how in society, as productive forces developed, gradually there took place a kind of split in society between those who had the resources, who had the intelligence, who had the capability of retaining their hold on productive forces. They wielded, they exercised real power. And the others, and they constituted a small minority. This is how primitive communism eventually was replaced by slave society. That is, those who were slave owners, they enjoyed real power. Those who were not, they were the slaves. So society, this is how society became divided, split into majority and minority. The minority controlled power with the help of their hold over productive forces, and the majority, they just remained the victim of those who were in power. This led to the rise of another concept, that is production relation. So productive forces lead to a particular kind of production relation. In slave society, you have one kind of production relation. In primitive communism, you have one kind of production relation. Then slave society was replaced by feudal society. Feudal society, you have on one side the landlords, the big landowners, and on other side you have the serfs. In capitalism, which replaced feudalism, the next stage of societal development or historical development, you have the capitalists, thus a small group, a small minority, which constitutes the real force in society, in the sense they retain their hold over the means of production, over the forces of production. They have the factories, they have the establishments, they have the production, they have the resources, everything under their control. Whereas the vast majority, they are just the victims of this system. And while describing these different types of society, Marx simultaneously argues that this is how society has advanced. That is, broadly, this is the pattern. That does not mean that in all societies, historical development will take place like this. But very broadly speaking, this is the pattern of historical development. Now, throughout this understanding, what Marx talks about, or what Marx refers to, is number one, that you have first two types of production relations. One kind of production relation, which Marx describes as antagonistic, where the productive forces and the production relation, well, they are contradictory. Productive forces conflict with production relations. That is, this kind of production relation Marx describes as antagonistic production relations. Whereas you have another kind of society where those who control the productive forces, well, it is they who constitute the majority, not the minority. So this is a kind of society which Marx dreams about. Marx calls it first socialism and then eventually communism. So under socialism and communism, you have the majority who control the productive forces, not the other way around. Under slave society, under feudalism, under capitalism, you have antagonistic production relations, as a result of which the productive forces are controlled by the minority, and that leads to an antagonistic production relation. Those who actually are involved in production, well, they are not the people who have control over productive forces. So those who are victims of, or those who suffer under production relations, they are different from the persons who control the productive forces. So these antagonistic societies, so societies marked by antagonistic production relation, they must be replaced by a new order which Marx calls socialism and communism. So this is one very important conclusion, very important implication of historical materialism. The other implication, and there we come across Marx's understanding of state, that is, the question that arises is that how it is possible for those who constitute the minority, who control the productive forces, to retain their hold over the production relations. How is it possible for those who control the productive forces to serve their own narrow, selfish interests by exploiting those who are involved in the production relations? That is, those who produce, they do not have any hold over production. But how is it possible for the system to go on like this? For that, those who have control over productive forces, they retain, or they require actually, an apparatus, an instrument, an institution, a structure, which Marx calls the state. This is how the state originated in human society. The state emerged in human society in order to enable those who control the productive forces to retain their hold over the society. And with the help of force, with the help of violence, with the help of coercive measures, you retain your hold over society, and for that the state comes to your rescue. So you require the state as a coercive machinery, as a coercive apparatus to serve your own narrow, selfish interests. So this is what Marx means by state. Therefore, unlike other political theories, say the Contractualists, for example, Marx's understanding of state is completely different. The Contractualists, they believe that state was the result of consent. For Marx, the state has nothing to do with consent. State is an expression of coercion. Similarly, Marx does not believe in that kind of understanding which preceded the Contractualists, who believed that state was the work of God. State was an expression of a kind of supernatural authority, like the God. Marx also did not believe in it. So Marx did not believe in any theological understanding of state. Marx did not believe in contractualist understanding of state. For Marx, state is an element of coercion. And in this context, Marx also introduces the element of class. That is, those who are involved in production relations, that is, they constitute the majority, who work, who produce, but do not have any hold over the products, their relationship with those who control power by their control over the productive forces. These two relationships, that is, this relationship of antagonism, that is the relation of two classes. The one is the majority, the other the minority. The minority and the majority, they are engaged in a relation of tussle, tension and conflict. And only in a society when, and Marx says that is the post-capitalist society, when capitalism will be replaced by socialism, and how it will be replaced, that is, a time will come when those who are involved in the production relationships, those who are the exploited majority, a time will come when they will rise up, they will wake up, and they will overthrow capitalism by taking hold of the productive forces. That is, there's a gap between those who control productive forces and those who are involved in production relations. When this gap will be bridged, then forces of production will become non-antagonistic, and capitalism will give way to a new society. Marx calls it socialism, which eventually will reach a higher level. Marx calls it communism. And that will be a time when class struggle, class conflict, class battle, class antagonism, which marked all other preceding societies, well, that will cease to exist. And when class struggle will no longer be there, state will also no longer be necessary. So state will eventually, to use Marx's phrase, it will wither away. That is, state was necessary, the state was required, the state emerged at a particular moment in history. When that moment will no longer be there, when society, that is antagonism, will be replaced by a non-antagonistic order, obviously you will no longer require the state. So the state will cease to exist. So this is, broadly speaking, Marx's understanding of state. Now, I will finally round up my discussion by taking up one point in Marx's theory of state, which is a very important contribution of Marx, but which is not very widely discussed, but obviously you will have to be familiar with this understanding. From the account that I have given you, you can guess for Marx the standard understanding is that a state is an instrument, state is an apparatus in the hands of those who constitute a small minority, that is the dominant oppressor class. So state is a kind of apparatus which is reflective of the interests of the small minority, a small dominant class. Under feudalism, it is controlled by the feudals. Under capitalism, it is controlled by the capitalists. In slave society, it was controlled by the slave owners. And it did not serve the interests of the vast majority. It did not serve the interests of the entire society. That is a popular common sense understanding of Marx's theory of state. But Marx also took into account a possibility, and Marx in a very sophisticated manner explained this phenomenon when Marx was studying contemporary European history, especially 19th century France. Marx's understanding was this, that yes, normally this is the impression that we get, that a state is reflective of the interests of the class which controls the productive forces, which controls thereby the entire production system, and which thereby establishes or retains its hold in society. That is true. But there may be situation, as was the situation which developed in France in mid-19th century when Marx was writing. The understanding of Marx was this: there may be situations where the ruling class, the class which controls the productive forces, well, that class itself is split into different factions. That is, you do not have the control of one single homogeneous class over the entire society. The class itself is split, fragmented into different sections. There what happens is the state itself emerges as an autonomous structure. Autonomous structure means in such a situation, certain interested sectors of state, maybe the bureaucracy, maybe the army, maybe the police, well, they may take advantage of this situation. Say, the police is aligned with the particular faction, with the dominant faction. The army is very closely aligned. The bureaucracy is very closely aligned with that particular faction, with that particular section, with that particular segment, which controls the state. That is, in such a situation, Marx says, the state structure becomes autonomous, not the class. So you have here a shift in Marx's understanding from class to structure. And this has led to, in the 1970s, a very famous debate between two scholars in Europe. One was Ralph Miliband, and the other is, Ralph Miliband was a British scholar, British political scientist. The other was Nikos Poulantzas, a French scholar. They actually were engaged precisely in this kind of debate. Ralph Miliband's understanding was this: under capitalism, you have always the class controlled by the dominant class of capitalists. That is, there is a homogeneous capitalist class which controls the state in its entirety. Whereas Poulantzas' understanding was that no, this does not necessarily happen. There we come across situations where you have the relative autonomy of the state, in the sense that not the entire class controls the state, but because the class itself is divided, because the class itself is faction-ridden, because of the fact that class itself is somewhat weak in a particular given historical situation. So that is why what happens in effect in many places is not the entire capitalist class controls it, but by taking advantage of the weakness of the capitalist class, the state structure, a particular faction, a particular segment of that class, that comes to dominate the state, and it is aligned with a particular segment of the state in that particular structure. So that gives you a fairly clear, I believe, a fairly clear idea of the complexity, the sophistication of Marx's theory of state, which in a way is to be explained with reference to a larger theory, which I have explained at the very beginning, the theory of historical materialism. With that, I conclude this episode of Marx's understanding of state in the light of materialist interpretation of history. Thank you.